Now, as we've discussed, today marks the one-year anniversary of the fall of Kabul following the Biden administration's withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. This after 20 years and $1 trillion invested in the country. The Taliban have held control of Afghanistan for a year, though the suspension of foreign aid and freezing of their foreign funds has spiraled the country into an economic crisis. Joining me now to discuss this, as well as his reflections on the 10-year anniversary of a gunman's attack on FRC, is retired Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin. He's a founding member of the Army's elite Delta Force and Family Research Council's Executive Vice President. General, good to see you today.
To be with you.
Now, with respect to Afghanistan, before we get into the military component of this, that's a subject, the persecution of the church in Afghanistan is a central part of a book that you've written. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's called Heroic Faith, and I am just one of three authors of this. And the other two ladies that were part of this have a lot of experience, especially Leila Gilbert has a lot of experience in the Middle East, and Ariel Del Turco is also very experienced in terms of religious persecution. And so we wrote this book to give a very clear picture of what's happening primarily to Christians, but not exclusively Christians, but to give a vivid description of what's happening to Christians all over the world as the persecution against Christians is growing, and there's there are more things happening today than ever in the history of the world that really are nothing but persecution of Christians.
And in the last segment, we talked to Jeff King from International Christian Concern, and one of the hopeful parts of that story is the idea that the church is flourishing. He was referred specifically to Iran, but the legacy of the Christian church in the darkest moments is when the Spirit moves most intensely, and people see God move in ways that He doesn't when we're comfortable. And so I think there is a silver lining in all of this. That being said, we have a duty and an obligation to stop suffering, to stop injustice, and that is certainly evidence of that.
Stand up against evil is basically what we're commanded to do.
That's exactly right. Now, you and I spoke last summer when this withdrawal from Afghanistan was happening. You were you were disturbed by what you saw. You have a lot of experience moving troops around, dealing with military operations. You now have the benefit of 1 year's hindsight. We've learned a bit. You had a chance to reflect. Do you feel differently today than you did watching the events a year ago?
If anything, I feel worse. I'm embarrassed, first of all. Secondly, I'm very upset about what we did as a nation because it violated so many standing ethos, American ethos, American values. But I believe that this is going to go down in history as the greatest foreign policy failure in the history of this country.
Now, it doesn't sound like you feel any better about the way that operation was conducted. Do you have a different perspective on what caused it now?
Now, I won't say my perspective has changed any. I will say that I have more information to support the way I felt when it was over.
And restate that for us. And so what is that?
First of all, there was no planning for this. The plans, there were some minor planning done in the spring, and then they didn't get back to it until like the week before they were going into Afghanistan. Secondly, the president ignored the advice of the people that are there to do just that, advise him. He ignored the advice of his intelligence community, for example, as well as the military and the State Department. And he wanted to do it his way, and that was absolutely wrong from the beginning. They ignored what was happening on the ground there, where the military and the intelligence community were telling them that the picture is not the way you see it. Here's what's really happening. And by the way, the Taliban will take over sooner rather than later. That was their word, sooner rather than later. And he ignored all of that, and it cost us our reputation, it cost us our relationships with our allies, and it cost us what I think is the worst of all of this, it caused us as a nation to violate our own standing values, the values upon which this nation was founded when we left those Americans behind and people that we had made a pledge to, a promise to. You work with us, we'll bring you out when we go home.
Now, General Boykin, at the beginning of the show, I talked to Congressman Stubbe, and I asked him this question, and I'll ask you as well, because there's this, the intelligence that the White House and the State Department received said one thing, and then the picture that the State Department and the White House painted seemed to be very different, much more positive, a much rosier perspective on what the situation in Afghanistan was. Do you have a sense for why that would happen? Is this a game of telephone where they misunderstood, or they just didn't like the implications of the intelligence they were receiving, and so they just said, we're gonna see this in a different way?
Yeah, when I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, I learned a lot about this very topic, in that if you politicize intelligence, it's only a matter of time until you're going to pay a tremendous price for it. You cannot politicize intelligence. If you don't like the answer from the intelligence community, that's tough. But you don't get the intelligence community to say what you want them to say or to tell you what you want them to tell you. That doesn't work.
Now, presumably, the Biden administration thought there was going to be some kind of political advantage to being the ones to withdraw. Because in fairness, there were a lot of people who wanted Afghanistan. They'd been talking about that for a long time. President Trump had wanted out of Afghanistan. President Obama certainly talked about it. The idea of getting out of Afghanistan is something that had, in principle, bipartisan support, right? So if his motivation was to be the one who got it done, has there been any kind of benefit to the White House from being the one who got it done?
The benefit is that he had the opportunity to kill Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul, where he was staying in his sanctuary. Now, that's being a little bit facetious. What I would say to you is the Europeans wanted us to stay, and the president had a false narrative about what was at stake here. It was either we go in and withdraw right now in this hurried fashion without proper planning, without all the logistics, and we'll leave them $83 billion worth of materiel, or I have to put thousands and thousands of Americans in there. Well, that wasn't the plan. The plan was, and what was requested was 2,500 to be there with 6,000 European allies. And the Europeans wanted us to stay. They didn't want to pull out. And look at what we did to them. We left some of them high and dry as well and put them in a really bad situation. So I think the president was not truthful with the American public about what his options were.
I also think that it's true, and I'll see if you agree with this, that any perceived political benefit President Biden could have had by being the one who withdrew from Afghanistan and got us out of this perpetual war kind of a situation was lost because of the execution of that. And in fact, because it was so generally seen as a debacle, as mismanaged, that set the tone for his administration, really, because it was so early on that he's underwater in almost every issue. Certainly foreign policy is one of them. Yeah. But do you agree that really was the beginning of the end for the Biden administration, where the public just kind of lost confidence in his ability to plan and make decisions and weigh the variables?
Yeah, you don't have to be a military or a diplomatic expert to know that you don't turn over a secure airfield like Bagram and then go to an airfield that you can't secure. And that was proven by the fact that we lost 13 Americans there. You don't evacuate all of the military and then think about the civilians. No, the civilians go out first. And there were a number of those kinds of things that I think I think it not only did it destroy his credibility as the commander-in-chief, but I believe that it was one of the stimulants for the decision by Vladimir Putin and probably by Xi to do what they're doing right now. One being to go into Afghanistan, and the other being to start harassing Taiwan again. I think that his performance there in Afghanistan was one of the stimulants for that.
Last question on this topic. We were there for 20 years, spent $1 trillion. About 2,500 service members lost their lives in Afghanistan. There were another 3,800 contractors who lost their lives in Afghanistan. Knowing what we know now, we look back. How should we think about the investment that the American people made in that country?
Why were we there? We were there to prevent al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups from having a safe haven from which they could execute another 9/11, and we kept that from happening for 20 years. For 20 years. Unfortunately, just based on the fact that we know Zawahiri was in Kabul when we hit him with the drone strike, we've reversed all the gains, and we did that in less than a month.
One final topic with you. 10 years ago today, a man, a deranged man, walked into this building in the office of the Family Research Council here in Washington, D.C. Intent. He was armed. He had extra ammunition in his backpack, as well as a bunch of sandwiches that he intended to throw at the feet, he later said, of the dead bodies that he hoped to create. Our friend and hero, Leo Johnson, prevented that from happening. He was shot in the process, but thanks to his heroic efforts, no one died that day. 10 years later, what are your reflections on that day?
Yeah, my reflections are this. The majority of the people, when they're confronted with a fight or flight situation, they take flight. You know, it's the safer way. It's just a human nature. Leo Johnson did just the opposite. He chose the fight option. And if you look at the video, and we showed it this morning here, it's awesome in that here was a guy that was confronted with that situation, and he went straight at the shooter. No hesitation.
And we're playing this now for those who are watching on NRB TV. Yes, how he did that. But keep going.
Yeah, well, he just went straight at him, and that was what saved probably a lot of people, because that guy told the judge that he was here to kill as many people as possible. Floyd Lee Corkins, as many people as possible. And then he was, as you said, he was going to smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich on their face or on their feet or whatever it was. And that was at that time when Chick-fil-A was under a lot of pressure because of their support for traditional marriage. And Mike Huckabee had rallied Americans all over the country to go to Chick-fil-A, and they had the biggest day they'd ever had in the history of Chick-fil-A. So that was going to be part of his statement.
He also explained why he targeted the Family Research Council. Let's play that in this statement. It's clip 7, and then we'll give you a chance to respond to that.
Now, how did you, this building, this organization, how did you find it early? Did you look it up online, or how did you know about it?
Southern Poverty Law lists anti-gay groups, and I found them online.
Okay.
A little bit of research, went to their website and stuff like that.
You hear him saying there that he went to the Southern Poverty Law Center, all these hate groups, of course, which they list Family Research Council as very erroneously. But is that still an issue today?
Very much so. They still have a hate map. And in fact, the guy that shot Steve Scalise a few years ago was also one who had been visiting the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map and website. And we've never heard a word from the Southern Poverty Law Center, but guess what? You know, what goes around comes around, I guess is the saying, at least it is where I come from, and the state that you live in right now, by the way. But if you think about it, Southern Poverty Law Center...
30 seconds.
Okay, Southern Poverty Law Center has been sued by their own people for sexist behavior, sexual harassment, and racism. Now, you think about that.
Ironic, isn't it?
They ought to be on their own list.
Ironic, isn't it, that the ones trying to stop the sexism and racism are being accused internally of that. But we are, again, today we're celebrating God's grace in protecting so many people and his promise to continue doing so. General, thanks for your time today.
Good to be with you.